To ask you about this vitamin D story. I was very passionate about the effects, the positive impact of vitamin D on health a few years ago. And the more people I've spoken to, the less enthusiastic I've been about the impact of vitamin D. It seems as though we do a lot of epidemiological studies, and the people with the highest vitamin D levels have the best health outcomes. And then the hypothesis is formed that vitamin D is protective. So we run clinical trials, we supplement vitamin D, and the benefits are not there. And it seems to me as though the benefit is in sunlight itself, not precisely in the vitamin D molecule. And that vitamin D, elevated vitamin D in the blood, is merely a proxy marker for living outside in sunlight.
And I think that's a very good series of points. And I think vitamin D is just one of the positive outcomes of natural sunlight exposure. Because we know that, when ultraviolet wavelengths impact and total solar wavelengths impact the skin, but especially ultraviolet is the most biologically active, that these not only affect vitamin D precursors, but a host of other bioactive molecules. I mentioned the effect on bioactive folates. We now know, and this is a result of work that has been done on one of my former postdocs, Tony Wolfe, and my colleague, Larry Kenny, all at Penn State, who have looked at sort of the combined effects of folate and vitamin D on vasodilation, right? On preserving vasodilation in the skin, which is really important for thermoregulation. So it still is important while we're exercising, but you can imagine just how important it was when we were much more active several thousand years ago, chasing prey or being chased by prey in our history, when we built up a lot of muscular heat that needed to be dissipated into the environment. So you need to have a lot of vasodilation so that you can provide water to sweat glands, as well as simply provide more blood flow to the skin for radiative and conductive heat loss. So it turns out, and this work you can read in several papers that we've published about the importance of sunlight, in this balance of maintaining proper vasodilation. You're right in saying that the vitamin D synthesis is just a marker, because it's an important marker, and there's no doubt that vitamin D, as it affects other organs when it's produced in the skin, is important. But what happens in the skin, and importantly, what happens over years of regular exposure. Many of these clinical studies that are being done now, people get vitamin D for, a few years, maybe even up to 5 years, but they're not being exposed in a systematic way to sunlight that is able to produce pre-vitamin D and vitamin D in the skin, and have other effects also. And one of the problems in doing this kind of experiment is the health and safety protocols that are involved now. It's very hard to get permission, for instance, for any kind of whole body radiation, let alone on a sort of year in, year out basis over the course of several years. Because I would venture it is under those conditions that you really see the benefit. When you have a human body that has been more regularly accustomed to some UV exposure, outdoors during life. So, simulating this in a laboratory experiment or even in a sophisticated, prospective epidemiological study is really tough, and it's really expensive. And of course, getting people to control their own sun exposure, record it, you can imagine. This is not easy, but I'm confident that we will get there with respect to providing more balanced prescriptions, as it were, for sun exposure according to people's ancestry, their age, where they live, what their habits are, and so forth. I think we may not have that perfect, knockout experiment, but we'll have enough data within the next 5 years to be able to say, okay, here's a little calculator that you can use. And if you go out, at this time of day, at your current latitude, and you expose your back or your upper arms or your thighs, areas that are not normally exposed, if you expose them for a while, you'll be much better off. And, quite honestly, I think the chronic lack of sun exposure and the problems with vasodilation that are related to this are one of the reasons that we see such high levels of hypertension in darkly pigmented people worldwide. In addition to, a host of other problems related more specifically to vitamin D deficiency. So, I think we just have to not just idly hope, but plan for prospective experiments and in vivo lab experiments of a circumscribed nature that will allow us to pin this down better. I'm very encouraged by the work of as I mentioned earlier, my former postdoc, Tony Wolfe, who's now at the University of Georgia. He's doing some great stuff, and I hope that we might get this personalized prescription as a result of some of his and his colleagues' work.